Hey everyone, welcome to Infill Lot Recon. My name is Mike Marshall with WholesaleLandDepot.com. For more than a decade, I've been helping investors learn how to avoid the landmines and capitalize on the opportunities that exist with vacant infill lots. If you are or have a goal of becoming an infill lot investor, you're in the right place. So today I'm going to be talking about hazard zones and how they can affect the potential build out of a residential infill lot. I'm going to try to be as succinct as possible and focus on 4 takeaways that you should leave here with at the end of the day. So here's what those 4 takeaways are. Number 1, no way in the floodway. Number 2, landslides can be a slippery slope. Number 3, building in a fault zone isn't necessarily impossible. And number 4 is a pro tip, use the local GIS. Okay, so with that, I'm going to go one by one here. No way in the floodway. So what that's referring to is the FEMA floodway designations. And yes, there's FEMA flood zones like A and O and AO and all these different kinds of zones. But in general, there's something that's called the floodway and the floodplain. And essentially, the floodway is the most affected part of the waterway. It's the most part that's centralized to the waterway. So if you imagine a river and you imagine the center line of that river, that essentially could be the floodway. And the larger the floodway is, the more impactful it is to private property. And so when you're looking at some FEMA flood maps, it'll be able to show you what the floodway is versus the floodplain, or something that's also referred to sometimes as the flood fringe. And so every community that is mapped with these FEMA maps, it has a map that's showing what the floodway is. And the most impactful thing about the FEMA floodway is that essentially you can't really build inside the floodway. That's kind of the take home of it. So the whole phrase "no way in the floodway" is very common within the whole FEMA community. And the idea again is that you can't build within the floodway, but you also can't do things like store landscaping or store, like shipping containers, or a variety of more commercial uses can't even occur within the floodway either. And it's really tough to be able to get those floodway limits to be managed or to be reduced in size. And really what it ends up requiring, it requires a civil engineer to do a floodway study, and that floodway study gets reviewed by the local jurisdiction to make sure that the methodology that is being used by the civil engineer is correct. And then that goes up to FEMA, and FEMA ultimately makes a determination as to whether or not that floodway jurisdictional limit should be reduced based on the information that you're providing. That's a very long-winded way of saying that it's going to cost you money to be able to roll the dice and see if FEMA's going to buy in and actually go and move those lines. And one other tip on that for you is that, if the area has been mapped more recently, then the chances of FEMA actually buying into a revision of the map is actually going to be really, really limited. The older those are, maybe you'll have a little bit more chance of doing that. But again, with all of these things, you really have to kind of balance it out. Is it worth it for you? If you're looking at a lot and the most of it is actually inundated by the FEMA floodway, it really may not be worthwhile to take the time to go through that whole effort. It really depends on the numbers involved. If nothing else, you need to be aware of it, because that's going to affect the marketability of that lot down the line. So again, the takeaway here is no way in the floodway. Be aware of it, look for it, and decide whether or not it's something that you want to actually move forward with. If you do want to move forward with something like that, you really need to consult a civil engineer and start talking about the idea of a floodway study, or your end buyer would actually need to be the one that actually consults with that civil engineer. But you just want to be aware of the kind of a hair that's on the deal. Number 2, landslides can be a slippery slope. Be aware of the fact that there are areas throughout the country that have historic landslides in them. And the best way for me to demonstrate this to you is to kind of tell you a quick story about some property in an area that I've worked in, where there's actually 4 infill lots that are just right next to each other, and they appear to be vacant. And all they do is they keep turning over over the years. They end up going to tax sales. Somebody picks them up, and then somebody ends up not paying their taxes, and then goes to tax sale, and it keeps churning over and over and over again. And the reality is, or the reason is that these 4 lots were part of a landslide back in the 1960s, and that landslide took out like all 4 of these houses. And ever since that time, these lots have remained vacant, and people don't do their due diligence, and they end up picking them up at tax sale thinking that they found this really great opportunity, something that's been sitting, this little gem that's been sitting that nobody else has been aware of. Somehow these 4 vacant infill lots have sat right in the middle of this existing subdivision for over 40, 50 years, and nobody's actually figured that out. And the reality is that, again, there's a story to every lot, there's a story to every parcel, and your goal is to be able to figure out what that story is. And in this case, there was a historical landslide there, and while it's possible to actually develop on the site, the reality is that the engineering that it's going to take, the cost that it's going to take to actually get those lots to be buildable is just really, really expensive. And so I've been watching those lots off and on over the course of the last 10 plus years, and nobody has ever been able to move on it. Nobody's been able to ever make that thing pencil. And so these lots just sit and sit and sit, and they churn over one owner to the next and everything. So you just got to be really careful when you start looking at something and you think that it's too good to be true. Sometimes that really is the case. And so again, your job is to really dig into it and be aware of what's going on. And so you have a lot, if you have a lot like these ones were, and they're backing up against a hillside that's running up to the top of another roadway or something, for example, and these lots are just sitting there, there's a reason why. And it could be a landslide issue, and it could be something completely benign and completely innocent, and it's just some fluke of all flukes that these things have sat there. Well, that's a possibility. The reality is that there's probably something more going on, and again, that's your job to figure that one out. So that's number 2. Number 3, building in a fault zone isn't necessarily impossible. Out in California here, we have something that's called these Alquist-Priolo fault zones. These are earthquake zones that exist, and when you look at some of the maps of the local jurisdictions on their GIS maps, you'll see these Alquist-Priolo fault zones mapped, and you're looking at it and you're saying, well, gee, these are mapped, but there's houses that are sitting right in the middle of this fault zone. Well, that's 2 reasons why that's happening. One, maybe that fault zone was mapped after the houses were actually subdivided and developed. That's part one. The other part of what could be happening too is that it is possible in some instances to build within the fault zone, but again, what it requires extra geological surveys or extra geological studies to be done to be able to justify the fact that a house can actually be built on that lot. So again, it's possible, but it may be difficult. It may be expensive to get an actual engineer to actually go out there and do the geo study and actually see what's going on out there. And again, it's one of those situations where you're going to spend money to be able to determine if you can actually build. So you're going to be able to spend money in order to determine if you can make any money. And so you just got to be aware of this one too. Again, like the big overarching point over this whole episode is that you got to figure out what the story is on these lots. You got to find out what's going on. You got to find out the reason why it is the way that it is. And, once in a while, you're going to come across these issues, and it's obvious as to why these things have sat the way they've sat for so long. So those are 3 of the main things that I would look at. And my last kind of pro tip for you is this. Every local jurisdiction has these really great GIS tools that are available to them now. And with the exception of maybe some very few rural counties, most of these counties and cities, they actually do have these great GIS systems that are available. And when you look at these systems, usually there's a button that says, I say, hey, add layers, or I'll say a list of layers or whatever for the GIS. And when you look at that, you really want to look at your property in context of each one of those layers. And so on the left-hand side, there's usually like a menu, and you can click on these little boxes as you go down that menu and see if that particular issue is affecting your property. So if it's something like even a homeowners association, or if there's protected tree species on the lot, or if it's in a fault zone area, or if it's in a floodway zone area, a lot of these jurisdictions have these tools available to you. And so you can get a lot of questions answered yourself just by going on and doing that digging. So I would highly suggest that you go onto those websites, go onto the GIS, and really take a look at your subject property in relation to those. It's a free tool all the time. You can get a lot of questions answered that way, and you can really get through a lot of your due diligence by using those tools that are available to you. So highly suggest you guys go ahead and do that. And so that's number 4. So number 1, no way in the floodway. Number 2, landslides can be a slippery slope. Number 3, building in a fault zone isn't necessarily impossible. And number 4 is a pro tip: go through the local GIS layers and get a good way to see how those things are actually affecting your property. So with that, that'll do it for this episode of Infill Lot Recon. Check out the next episode where we'll talk more about infill lot due diligence that'll help you avoid the landmines and take advantage of the opportunities found with infill lot investing. If you have any comments or questions, or if you're interested in my consulting services, go ahead and email me at info@wholesalelanddepot.com. As always, you can find us on YouTube or on our website at wholesalelanddepot.com. See you next time. Thanks.